Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of our podcast. Today we have the following story, Living Abroad, the Culture Shock. Are you ready? Let's go. I remember stepping off the plane that first morning in Tokyo, the air already heavy with summer humidity and the scent of unfamiliar blossoms carried on the wind, and though I had spent months preparing for this move, reading blogs, watching videos, practicing basic Japanese phrases, nothing could have prepared me for the tidal wave of disorientation that would hit me in the days and weeks that followed. A strange blend of fascination, awe, and low-key panic, because living abroad wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a full-scale rearrangement of my inner world. I had come on a year-long work exchange program, fresh out of university, seeking adventure and hoping to shake the dust off the predictable path that lay before me, but as soon as I stepped into that tiny apartment in the western suburbs of the city, barely large enough to stretch my arms in, I realized that this experience was going to challenge more than my comfort zone, it was going to challenge my very identity, because almost immediately, everything I thought I knew about normalcy, politeness, rhythm, and social interaction began to unravel in the most humbling ways, from bowing instead of shaking hands to the rigid hierarchy in workplace communication, where even my tone of voice was subject to cultural expectations I hadn't yet begun to understand. And then there was the language, endlessly nuanced, with formal and informal modes that twisted my brain into knots every time I tried to form a sentence, not to mention the written characters that danced across every sign, every menu, every train schedule like an unsolvable puzzle, which meant that grocery shopping became a daily exercise in educated guessing, and ordering food sometimes involved pointing helplessly at plastic models in restaurant windows, praying I wasn't about to eat something I couldn't identify, and yet, amid the confusion and awkwardness, there was beauty, breathtaking, delicate beauty in the small details, the precision of a tea ceremony, the quiet elegance of people giving up their seat for an elderly passenger without fanfare, the way schoolchildren in matching uniforms marched in perfectly orderly lines, greeting strangers with bright, rehearsed voices, and even though I often felt like I was floating outside the glass, looking in on a world that made sense only to everyone else, I began to realize that part of adapting wasn't just about fitting in, it was about letting go, about releasing the need to impose my own cultural lens on everything I encountered, and learning instead to be curious, to be open, and to embrace being a learner again, even if that meant making mistakes every single day. I remember one moment in particular, about 2 months in, when my supervisor at work gently corrected me for offering a business card with only one hand instead of two, a gesture I hadn't even realized was significant. And instead of being offended or embarrassed, I found myself grateful, because each small correction was a piece of a larger puzzle, helping me reconstruct a new version of myself, not one that discarded who I had been, but one that expanded to include more empathy, more nuance, more awareness of how deeply culture shapes the way we move through the world. And then there were the deeper, less visible shocks, the emotional tremors that came late at night, when I missed home with a dull ache I couldn't shake, missed spontaneous conversations without language barriers, missed my mom's cooking, missed belonging without effort, because in Tokyo, even as I made friends and learned the train lines and celebrated small victories like navigating a doctor's appointment without a translator, there was always a sense of being an outsider, of being stared at on the subway, of never quite measuring up to the unspoken rules everyone else seemed to know from birth, and I had to learn to sit with that discomfort, to not let it harden into bitterness or defensiveness, but instead to let it teach me humility, resilience, and eventually, pride, not in being perfect, but in continuing to try. The seasons changed while I was there, sakura petals in spring, typhoons in summer, golden leaves in autumn, snow in the winter that dusted the shrines like powdered sugar, and with each shift in the landscape, something in me shifted too, so that by the end of the year, when it was time to return home, I was no longer the same person who had boarded the plane with wide eyes and restless energy. I had learned to speak with pauses and listen without interrupting, to eat with chopsticks and navigate silence without awkwardness, to accept that in some cultures, indirectness is kindness, and efficiency isn't always better than tradition, and perhaps most importantly, I had learned that identity is not a fixed thing, not a checklist of traits or a passport or even a language, it's fluid, a dance between who you were, who you are becoming, and the countless influences that shape you along the way. And so when I came back home and found myself bowing slightly without thinking or craving miso soup on a rainy day or missing the sound of cicadas in summer, I realized that culture shock doesn't just hit when you arrive somewhere new, it also hits when you come back, because you carry with you not only memories, but habits, perspectives, and parts of yourself you didn't know were there until you lived somewhere else long enough for them to grow roots, and even now, years later, I still find traces of that time showing up in unexpected places, in how I organize my space, in how I interpret silence, in how I notice things I used to overlook, and I'm grateful, not just for the beauty and novelty, but for the disorientation too, because it taught me that growth often begins in discomfort, that understanding requires more than observation, it requires immersion, and that sometimes, in losing your footing, you find a deeper, steadier ground inside yourself, built not on certainty, but on the capacity to adapt, to learn, and to belong, even in unfamiliar places. So, we have reached the end of our story today. Thank you very much for being with me until now. See you in the next episode.